Is being bored bad for children? I'm Dr. Emily Sherwood. Welcome to this first episode of Painting and Parenting. If you're interested in literacy and parenting topics from an international perspective and a perspective of different cultures, please like and subscribe. So this is my first episode of painting and parenting, which is a new concept I have. Those of you who have seen me know that I usually talk about literacy, and it's kind of a scholarly perspective, and I'm still doing some of that, but I'm just ready for something kind of different, and I thought this would be fun. So what a lot of people don't know about me is that in addition to being a reading specialist who's worked both in the United States and in China, and English as a second language teacher, and now a mom and a wife living in rural South Carolina, I also am a bit of an artist. I'm just kind of a hobbyist. I'm not ready to sell my work, anything like that. But when I did live in China during COVID, there was a group of expat women from all over the world who got together and did what's called mandalas, which are dot art. And I really loved that. And I kind of got out of it when I came back to the United States because the paint that we used was imported from Russia, and in China it was very cheap. Here it was very expensive and very hard to find. But I took a class several years ago that taught about using dot tools. And I wanted to give that woman credit, but I think that she is no longer doing the classes. I think she had some personal things going on. But a woman from Canada did a fantastic online class with dot art, and so now I'm using tools, and I'm just kind of now getting back into it because my daughter's going to be one, which is hard to believe, in 2 weeks, so she's able to do a few more things, and we got kind of in more of a routine. So I paint. I'm doing a unicorn theme because I'm talking about boredom in this episode, and what that means for children, and the importance of children learning to think for themselves and harness skills without constantly having to be busy. So this is kind of a unicorn theme. Unicorns are something that's very imaginative in Western culture. It's also something that's a little bit personal because in academia you call people who are unicorns are just really hard to find because they've got skills that are really valuable and hard to find. And I've been called a unicorn before because I do have the mix of teaching English as a second language and literacy, which is pretty rare. Unfortunately, it's not as valuable as I thought it would be when I got that degree. It's just how it is. But I chose unicorns for that. So I chose this topic, so I'm going to start by using white. So showing here, I've done this stencil. The stencil's just from Dollar Tree. I've had it for years, but I really like Dollar Tree. We don't have a Dollar Tree locally anymore. It's about 30 minutes away, but I've had these stencils forever, since I first came back from China in 2022. So I'm going to start with white, and I'm just going to do one little piece at a time. And I'm starting here from the bottom because for me, this is the top. I did it this way so you can see the whole picture, but you always start furthest away from you because it won't smear as much. So yeah, boredom. Going back to our topic. So in my life, which is still fairly new, my daughter will be a year old in a couple of weeks, and I'm an older mom. She was born at 42, and I'm in all these mom groups, and it's interesting because there's always kind of the same tone to most of the comments. To most of the posts. A lot of them have to do with children's development, and when that happens, there's always the same tone, which is one of mild panic. If it's a health-related topic, something that, there's really concern that the child might be in danger, there's always this panic. There's always this kind of condescending tone of, I'm trying my best, but I don't know what to do, and I feel like I failed, which is not good. But in this culture, parents, particularly moms, they have everything on them. Many cultures, there's a lot of guidance from others, particularly grandparents, that in East Asia, children are still primarily raised by grandparents, and the grandparents provide a lot of the nurturing, so parents have some kind of advice about what to do. They get that from their grandparents or from other relatives, particularly in China where I lived. It was very obvious that grandparents were doing most of the work. You would go somewhere and you would see grandparents with children all the time. Sometimes the parents would be there, sometimes they wouldn't. But there would be that support there, that you had another somebody older than you who has done this before to tell you. And in many developed countries, particularly in Europe, also Australia, New Zealand, countries that we would consider Western, Canada, there are a lot of government resources. So, for example, parents might have a nurse come once the baby's born to help them get used to being parents. They have oftentimes subsidized daycare. They have all kinds of groups to help parents to be better parents, financial support. But here in the United States, we don't have that. And everything is on the parent. Generally speaking, there's not a whole lot of extended family support. That varies. Sometimes grandparents help quite a bit and aunts and uncles and things. But generally speaking, the parents are supposed to do it all in the United States, which is a very hard thing to do. And so there's always the same tone with these posts that they just feel down on themselves. They don't know what to do, and they feel like they're doing a bad job. And many times parents are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. And that's how I feel with this topic that's continually coming up with these groups, which is, I don't know what to do with my baby. My baby's getting bored. The other day, the woman had a 4-month-old that posted this. And she said, I need activities for my baby. And there's a whole market around this because I am a mom and I get things all the time that come up on ads where there's gadgets for babies. There's, even for the youngest kids, there's sensory kits for when they're just infants that have, you get to box them up with developmentally appropriate activities. And none of that's really necessary at all. But there's this idea in society that even from babyhood, children should be busy and they shouldn't be bored and they should have stuff going on. And you see that all the time. If you go anywhere, just about in the United States, you will see a child, a toddler, or even sometimes younger, and they will have an iPad or a cell phone or some kind of toy app that is electronic in nature, and they will be playing with it. There's all kinds of educational programs for children because there's this idea that children need to be busy. And then when children get older, and that's what a good parent does. A good parent keeps their child engaged and busy. And then as the child gets older, there's even this idea of, I'm going to make this horse blue, which I know horses aren't usually blue, but hey, it's my thing. And then as they get older, there's this idea of equating busyness with safety. So more and more in the United States, children are attending after-school programs, even up into the middle school years, because there's this idea that they need to be busy or they're going to get in trouble. And by that, they usually mean they're going to get into something that's not good for them, like potentially drugs or exploitation. Someone's going to hurt them if they're not busy. They're just going to get into things. They're going to see things on TV that aren't good, something like that. And even as a teacher, when I taught middle school, what I heard all the time was, in these faculty meetings, was you've got to keep the kids busy or they're going to get in trouble. And I remember when I was young, there was kind of this evolution of this idea because I was born in kind of the first part of the digital era. I was born in 1982, and at that time we were kind of getting away from kind of the traditional way of life. And when I say that, I mean what life was like from about the 50s to the 80s. From about the baby boom era, which was, the mid to late 1940s, I would say, until the 1980s, there was this idea of the family where the mom stayed home and they did all kinds of wholesome things together and children learned life skills, and that's where a lot of this busyness started because people had leisure time, and at that time they had extra money for the most part for sports, for to lead the sports, to lead activities. And so in my era, most mothers were working. They were starting to go back to work. And there was still this idea that children just really had to be busy for their development. And it was also what they call the age of anxiety. I think that's still a good name for this culture, where there were news reports all the times about crazy things that happened to kids. That was when they had the news channel that said, it's 11 o'clock, do you know where your children are? And there are all these drug prevention programs because there were just so many dangers to kids. That's when kind of all that began. These drug prevention programs, we had DARE, and which was a program that we had weekly, and they were, at school, they were totally shoving down your throat this idea of safety, 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 and safety involved being with other people, and it involved having outlets to do things. You didn't want to be all by yourself, just doing nothing, because then you'd get in trouble. And there was a big push also socially for extracurricular and academic enrichment. The school I went to was very, very socially stratified. I haven't been in a school since then that was quite like the school I went to. It was a solid middle class school. There was status associated with what activities you did, particularly the middle school. And if your child was in the chorus ensemble, that was a sign of your child being good. And most of the students there were not incredible singers. I mean, they had good voices, they did, but there were students who who had much better voices. Thinking of one person I knew who was really involved with her church choir, and she didn't make the ensemble choir, and it was because she was very hyper, and they didn't want to take her on these trips. And so the ensemble choir was made up of, because they were the best kids in the school, which really meant mostly white kids. I think the ensemble choir was like 30 kids, and there were maybe 2 or 3 faces that were not white. And they were mostly academically gifted, which is a whole nother story, I could talk forever about that. I had a traumatic experience dealing with the academically gifted program at the school because it was very, very, very much status-based. But and they happened to be a lot of kids who had parent support. So almost every child who was in that chorus, their parent was really involved. And that's an example of status with extracurricular activities, and this idea that even the right activities would get you places. So, and this was also the era in, I think it was Bill Clinton's first administration, as it was probably 92 or 93, where there were all these ideas of having all these community centers and having them like open at midnight, where you would go and kids would play basketball in these inner cities. Because there was this idea that, particularly in some of these rougher areas, children needed something to do because, again, they had to stay busy. They needed something other than what was going on in the community, which may not have been positive. And that goes into a lot of other things. That goes into racism and classism and all kinds of things. But it was there. And now it's taken on kind of even a different level, where we now have all these after school programs, and even for babies, there's this idea of your online now are in-person classes. There are music classes. I was interested in my child taking some music classes, so potentially me teaching some early childhood classes. So I was looking at this program out of California where they did baby classes with music, and I'm not a musician, but I thought, well, maybe this had some things that I could take from, maybe some of the themes and ideas they had. And I'll never forget, the woman who was doing the class looked at the parent and she said, "Oh, we're training them on how to sing because she's going to sing in a few years." And this was an infant, maybe 3 or 4 months old. "So you have to make sure your tone's right when you sing with her." This was a baby. I mean, a teeny tiny baby. And there was this idea that she already needed to train to be a professional singer. And in the classroom, we're starting to see that a lot as well. So students, again, especially middle school, but also in high school, even in elementary school, there's this idea you got to keep them busy or something's going to happen. Discipline problems will happen. And so things are very, very structured, and you are supposed to give a lot of wiggle room, because from a classroom management standpoint, that's asking for trouble. For example, I would try to do differentiated activities and they would fall through. In other words, activities that the students could kind of do on their own, which is very high level thinking, that would fall through. And that's in part because students didn't know how to think, and that's a societal problem, and we could talk about that later. It has to do with screen time, that has to do with with all kinds of things, students not reading, all kinds of issues. But it's also because the kids could not be bored. They could not sit for 1 minute and think on their own about what to do. The kids literally, they had to have something going on every second of the day or they would get in trouble. And again, that goes back to the idea of safety, the idea that children need something to do all the time or they won't be safe. And the research shows that that's really not how it is. First, the idea of safety, that the world has gotten so dangerous that we need this. Violent crime has actually been down for many years. There's the main difference is that people in communities used to watch out for each other. So in other words, in the 1950s and 1960s, particularly in urban areas or suburban areas, kids could walk around or ride their bikes, and if something were to happen, the kid were to fall or somebody was to get hurt, or there was just some weirdness, like there was someone there that shouldn't be there, the neighbor would watch out for that child, and there likely would be a neighbor home. A day when both parents work and there's not a lot of extended family support, there's not always someone home, and so therefore things can happen that wouldn't have happened before. And it's not necessarily because the world is less safe. Our children are more at risk, and also infrastructure, which again could be a whole nother conversation about how things are set up. They're not set up to walk anymore, they're set up to drive. But that's I could go down a whole rabbit hole about that and how bad the United States is with that. But anyway, in other countries, children still largely are expected to be bored, and it's not a sign of a bad parent or a bad teacher. In other countries, programs like after-school programs and tutoring, what we call enrichment programs like art, music, dance, that kind of thing. It's a luxury for rich people because in most of the world still, there is not the disposable income to do that, to go to these extra programs and to do these extra things. And you see that some in the United States, even in some of the poor neighborhoods that may have a lot of immigrants who are just starting out, or some of the inner city or some of the rural neighborhoods, especially rural neighborhoods, but students are expected to be bored, and that's just how it is. You can help mom with cooking, you can do chores, but a lot of times you're just sitting. You may be looking at something on TV, you may be reading, you may go outside and explore nature. But there's not this idea that you have to be busy all the time. This is largely a white middle class idea in America, and because that is the dominant culture that tends to have the more money and resources compared to minority cultures in America. That's kind of gotten exported, and now there are these ideas that are in minority cultures and so forth. There are all these enrichment groups and groups that work with children and so forth. But the research shows the enrichment part of it could be good. The child gets to learn something after school. That's good. Or whenever the child's learning. That's really good. But the child does not need to be busy all the time. They just don't. And when I was particularly when I was in Southeast Asia. I spent some time in Southeast Asia, particularly during COVID. That's a whole other story. I was a COVID refugee. I couldn't go back to China for about 3 months. I was kind of stuck because we were being advised not to go back to China yet, and I didn't want to go back to the United States because I might get stuck there, which happened to a lot of people. So I was in Vietnam and Thailand. I was actually on Thailand on vacation when COVID hit. A whole other story, and I'm going to write a book about it because it's a very interesting story. Kind of my claim to fame. I think that'll probably be the story my grandchildren tell. But anyway, in those countries, in Thailand and Vietnam, the children were still kind of wandering around on their own, and it wasn't uncommon to see children walking around, and many times they had parents with them or grandparents, because again, grandparents are imported in cultures. But I remember in Vietnam, school was out because of COVID, and there was this group of boys who were probably 6 or 7 years old, and they had their bikes. They were just walking around. They were just hanging out. They were just chilling, exploring things. You would see them stop and look at things, maybe look at how a brick was laid because there was a lot of architecture. They would look at the cars and how silly they were because the traffic there was crazy, but the kids were just hanging out. That was a very common thing. And in that culture, it was fine for a child to be bored and to not have something to do every moment of the day. And in China, usually there was a parent accompanying the child. You would see high school students out on their own, but usually there was a parent or a grandparent. Oftentimes it was a grandparent. Sometimes you would see kids on their own, like in coffee shops that were very close to home, but sometimes the older sibling or cousin, but usually it was grandparents. But children would not have devices with them. They would not be busy every second of the day. So if you would go on the subway, for example, because I was in a city, and even when I traveled, it was the same in the other cities, you would see young children and parents or grandparents, sometimes big families, several people. And the children would just be being held. Even toddlers, like to age 3 or 4, they would just be sitting quietly with a parent or grandparent, whoever they were with. And I remember some very interesting interactions along with this. So I remember that I was in a very crowded subway in Guangzhou, which is where I was at the very far south, in late 2019. And there was a family of, a Chinese family of slightly older parents. They're probably in their 40s, which I did that too. And they had, I'm trying to decide what colors to use for this rainbow, because I don't remember all the colors. I think I'll do the rainbow last. I'll do this other unicorn. But they had twins that were about 2 years old, and they were just really having a hard time sitting still. They were little, and it was very crowded, and the trip was, I think that we were on the way for probably an hour. And I remember the kids independently, one of them started reaching for the bars that were in the subway and started entertaining himself. He started kind of pushing up and going around, and he went from side to side on the bar, and the other kid started as well. And that's an example of a kid finding entertainment where there usually isn't one. But it occurred to me about how in the United States, those parents would probably have the kids on some sort of iPad or toy, or they would be doing something that was considered engaging with that child. Because again, there's this idea that children should be busy. And particularly young children in China are better regulated. There's a big problem with internet addiction and with mental health with children in China, but that usually happens a little bit older once they start having cell phones. Children are generally calmer in China and can regulate their emotions better. But I remember another trip I was on a subway. There was a little girl, probably 4 years old, and the father, and she was being really fussy. She was having a hard time. And the father just took her, he put his arms around her, and he helped her to kind of rest. And her eyes closed, she kind of went to sleep. Again, that's something that I don't think you would see a lot in the United States, that a child was able to do that on their own. But again, children deal with boredom in a different way. They use what they have to be creative, and they don't need to be entertained every second of the day. And we have a big problem in this country with ADHD, and part of that has to do with diagnosis. I'm not saying that there aren't people who have ADHD who need help, but there's a benefit to diagnosing children in this country, and it's a trend that started again in the 80s. And I have another story about that myself, but you don't see that in other countries. And again, a lot of these things do go undiagnosed, and there may be kids who do have ADHD, but it's not to the same extent as here. And the idea of oppositional defiant disorder, that's just not a thing. And again, part of that has to do with diagnosis and culture and what is acceptable and so forth. But what I'm saying is, I believe that a big part of it is that here kids have to be busy. And there's this idea that you have to engage students at all times, and that, an active child, meaning a child who has something to do, is very important. And we're seeing a lot of kids now who are having issues. I had children come up to my baby and just started playing with her and just being kind of physically aggressive, and they just couldn't, like, literally I said no, and I even took her, and they're trying to get her again because there's this idea that they have to have something to occupy their minds. Oh, and there's a cute baby to play with. We can play with the baby. So that's just my thoughts on that. And my husband grew up in Latin America, and it was the same thing. You were expected to be bored, and girls would play house, and boys would play soccer or go to the river, but they would organize it on their own. And there was not this idea of need for safety. And I also saw a video a few years ago of a school in Japan. It was a preschool where the kids had a tremendous fight on the playground, and the teacher just sat there and let them work it out. There's this idea that kids needed to work things out. They needed to problem solve. They needed to do things on their own instead of always having adults step in. But again, that goes back to this view of safety, that you have to keep kids safe. That's the most important thing ever. And now it's gone into emotional safety as well as physical in the United States. Again, I think there is something to that. I think children's emotional needs have been neglected a lot, and we're at a point in society where it's more important than ever. But at the same time, children need to figure things out on their own and not always have somebody do it for them. That's my take on it. So I'm interested in your culture, in your community. What are you seeing about this idea of children and busyness? Is that something that you see in your community? What are the policies that your community has that either reinforce this or are different? And what do you think about children having to be bored or having to come up with their own activities and not being busy all the time? So I have done about half of this, and I will do the rest of it, and then I will post it so you can see the end. But thank you so much for joining me today, and please comment. Also comment based on this topic and what you see. But I would love to hear from you also about what kind of things you like, and if you like this format, if you don't like this format, please, I would love to hear from you. And until next time, keep learning.